Why is my girlfriend hiding me from her family? Grace was always making excuses when I asked to meet her family, even though we'd been dating for 6 months. One day I saw her at the farmer's market with an older couple who were obviously her parents. I walked over to introduce myself, and she pretended not to know me. "I think you have me confused with someone else," she said, and her mom smiled politely while her dad steered them away, leaving me standing there like an idiot. That night, she came to my apartment crying and apologizing, saying she'd panicked and she was so sorry, but her parents were complicated and she needed more time. She said they were really strict and wouldn't approve of her dating anyone right now, which seemed like a weak excuse for pretending I didn't exist, but I loved her, so I let it go. 3 weeks later, I was at a coffee shop by myself when her brother walked in. I recognized him from photos on her phone. I figured brothers were different from parents, so I introduced myself as Grace's boyfriend, and his face dropped. "Grace doesn't have a boyfriend," he said. "She can't have a boyfriend." "What do you mean she can't?" I asked. He looked around nervously and leaned in closer. "Just stay away from her," he said. "For your own good." Before I could ask what that meant, he was gone. When I told Grace about it, she got angry and said her brother was just protective and I shouldn't have approached him. But there was something in her eyes that looked like fear. "What are you so scared of?" I asked. "My family has rules," she said. "Strict rules." I started paying more attention and noticed other weird things. Grace never invited me to her apartment. She paid for everything in cash, never cards. She had 2 phones and would sometimes answer the second one speaking quietly and hanging up fast when she noticed me watching. One day I followed her home, which I know was wrong, but I was going crazy with questions. She lived in this normal-looking house in a suburb, nothing special about it. But when her dad came out to get the mail, I noticed he was wearing an ankle monitor, the kind they put on people under house arrest. That night, I confronted Grace about it. "Why is your dad wearing an ankle monitor?" She broke down and admitted her father had been in trouble with the police, that he'd been under house arrest for 6 months, and she didn't want me getting pulled into their mess. "What did he do?" I asked. "He saw something he shouldn't have," she said. "Wrong place, wrong time. Now they're protecting him, but also keeping him prisoner." "Who's they?" I asked. "The people who put him in witness protection," she said, then covered her mouth like she'd said too much. "Witness protection?" I said. "Like in movies?" She nodded, tears running down her face. "He saw something bad happen. Really bad. And the people who did it are dangerous. So the government moved us here and gave us new names and told us we could never tell anyone who we really were." Finally, answers that made sense. Her fake name, the 2 phones, the terror when I'd approached her with her parents. They were hiding from dangerous people. "What did he witness?" I asked. "I don't know," she said. "They won't tell us. They say it's safer if we don't know." But something felt off about her story. I searched online for witness protection and learned that people in the program weren't usually under house arrest with ankle monitors. They were free to live normal lives as long as they followed the rules. So why was her dad being monitored? I hired a private investigator because I needed answers. 3 days later, he called me and said to meet him immediately. When I got to his office, he was packing his things. "I'm refunding your money," he said. "I can't help you." "What did you find?" I asked. "Your girlfriend doesn't exist," he said. "Grace Turner has no birth certificate, no school records before 2 years ago, nothing. That whole family appeared out of nowhere. That's witness protection," I said. "She told me." He shook his head. "I checked with my contact at the marshal's office. They're not in witness protection, but whoever created their identities did a professional job. These aren't amateurs." "Then who are they?" I asked. "People who needed to disappear," he said. "And usually when a whole family needs to disappear that badly, it's because they're running from someone." I went to her house that night, determined to get real answers. The front door was open and the house was dark. I called out, but nobody answered. In the living room, I found Grace's father tied to a chair with duct tape over his mouth, his eyes wide with terror when he saw me. Before I could move, I heard Grace's voice behind me saying, "I really wish you hadn't come here tonight. Requested Reads is on Spotify now. Check out link in the description or comments." I spun around and saw Grace holding a kitchen knife, but her hand was shaking and tears were running down her face. Her father made desperate sounds through the tape, and I realized he wasn't warning me about intruders. He was warning me about what Grace might have to do to protect her family. My legs finally worked, and I took a step backward, but Grace grabbed my arm hard enough to leave marks. She pulled me close and whispered fast that men were coming back any minute, and if they found me here, everyone would be in danger, including me. I started to argue, but she shoved me toward the kitchen, practically dragging me across the tile floor. She yanked open the pantry door and pushed me inside so hard I crashed into metal shelves, knocking over cans that clattered loud enough to wake the whole neighborhood. I caught myself against the back wall, surrounded by boxes of cereal and pasta, and Grace put her finger to her lips in a silent command before shutting the door. The space was tiny and dark except for thin strips of light coming through the slats, and my breathing sounded way too loud in the enclosed space. Through the gaps, I watched Grace rush back to her father and start ripping the duct tape off his wrists. She peeled the tape from his mouth, and he gasped for air, and she whispered something I couldn't hear while untying the ropes around his ankles. He rubbed his wrists where the tape had left red marks, and Grace helped him stand up, supporting his weight as they moved slowly toward the kitchen table. She positioned him in a wooden chair and filled a glass with water from the sink, setting it in front of him like they were just having a normal evening. Her father picked up the glass with shaking hands and took a sip, and Grace straightened his shirt collar and smoothed down his hair, making everything look ordinary. She gathered up the torn tape and rope, stuffing them in the trash under the sink, and then she sat down across from him and folded her hands on the table. The whole staging took maybe 90 seconds, and then they just sat there in silence, waiting. I pressed my eye against the widest slat, trying to see more of the room, and my phone felt heavy in my pocket. Heavy footsteps came from the front of the house, and I heard the door open without anyone knocking. 2 men walked into the kitchen wearing dark polo shirts with some kind of logo on the chest, and they moved like they owned the place. One was tall and thin with gray hair, and he checked his watch like he was annoyed about something. The other guy was younger and bigger, with thick arms and a neck that barely fit his collar. The younger one walked over to Grace's father and asked if he was ready to cooperate properly now, and the way he said it made my stomach hurt. There was no anger in his voice, just this casual cruelty like he was asking about the weather. Grace's father nodded and said yes in a quiet voice, and the younger man smiled and patted him on the shoulder. I pulled my phone out with hands that wouldn't stop shaking, nearly dropping it twice before I got it steady. I opened the voice recorder app and hit the red button, then held the phone up near the slats where the microphone could pick up sounds from the kitchen. The older man started talking, and I heard him say his name was Clinton Black. He mentioned something about protocol breaches and corrective measures, using words that sounded official and professional, but felt threatening. He asked Grace's father about his activities over the past week, and her father recited a boring list of grocery shopping and doctor appointments. Clinton pulled out a tablet and scrolled through something, comparing what he was hearing to whatever was on the screen. Grace sat perfectly still the whole time, and then Clinton turned to her and asked her to confirm her schedule. She stood up and started reciting like she was giving a school presentation, listing every place she'd gone and every person she'd talked to. She said she went to work at the coffee shop, came home, went to the grocery store, came home, went to her friend Sarah's apartment, came home. It sounded rehearsed and robotic, and I realized she'd done this exact routine many times before. Clinton asked if she'd contacted anyone outside approved channels, and Grace said no without any hesitation. The younger man walked around the kitchen looking at things, opening cabinets and checking inside, and I held my breath every time he got close to the pantry. He picked up mail from the counter and flipped through it, then put it back down. Grace kept talking, confirming she hadn't used any unapproved devices or met with anyone not on her approved contact list. Clinton asked about me specifically, and I almost dropped my phone again when I heard him describe my car down to the make and model. He said a neighbor reported suspicious activity, someone watching the house from a parked vehicle. Grace's face stayed calm, and she told him I was just a casual friend from the coffee shop who gave her a ride home once when her car wouldn't start. She said I didn't know anything about her real situation, and she'd kept everything separate like she was supposed to. Clinton stared at her for a long moment, and I could see her hands gripping the edge of the table, but her expression never changed. My phone buzzed in my hand with a text message, and the vibration felt as loud as a gunshot in the quiet pantry. I fumbled with it, nearly throwing it against the shelves in my panic, and managed to hit the side button to silence it completely. Through the slats, I saw Clinton's head turn slightly toward the pantry, and his eyes narrowed like he was listening for something. I pressed myself against the back wall and stopped breathing, watching him take a step in my direction. Grace said something about the refrigerator making weird noises lately, and Clinton stopped and looked back at her. The younger man laughed and said, "Old houses always had strange sounds," and then they moved on to other questions. 20 more minutes crawled by while they asked about bank accounts and phone records and medical appointments, and every question came with a veiled threat about what would happen if the answers were wrong. Grace's father answered everything in that same quiet, defeated voice, and Grace confirmed details when Clinton asked her to verify something. Finally, Clinton closed his tablet and said they'd be back for the regular check next week. The younger man reminded them that any changes to their routine needed to be reported immediately, and then both men walked out of the kitchen. I heard the front door open and close, and then silence. Grace sat frozen in her chair, counting under her breath, and I watched her lips move as she reached 60. She stood up and walked to the pantry, pulling the door open slowly. Her face was pale and exhausted, with dark circles under her eyes that I'd never noticed before. I stepped out of the pantry and demanded to know what the hell was going on, and my voice came out louder and angrier than I meant it to. Grace started crying, not the quiet tears from before, but actual sobs that shook her whole body. She said her father didn't just launder money, he testified against people who now wanted him dead. She said Black Protective Solutions wasn't protecting them. They were controlling them in exchange for keeping quiet about something bigger. Her father put his head in his hands, and Grace kept talking, saying BPS had them trapped with contracts and threats and surveillance, and there was no way out. Grace grabbed my arm and pulled me toward the front door, saying I needed to leave right now and forget everything I saw here. I told her I couldn't just walk away after seeing her dad tied up and hearing those men threaten her family, but she got angry and said my hero complex was going to get us both killed. She said I didn't understand what these people were capable of, or how they punished anyone who interfered with their business. I asked what I was supposed to do. Just pretend none of this happened, and she said yes, exactly that, because the alternative was both of us ending up dead, or worse. Her father called out from the kitchen, asking if everything was okay, and Grace yelled back that everything was fine. She whispered that I needed to go out the back door while she kept her father busy in the kitchen. I wanted to argue more, but the fear in her eyes stopped me cold. She kissed me quickly and said she was sorry for dragging me into this mess, then pushed me toward the hallway leading to the back of the house. I moved through the dark hallway, trying not to make noise, my hands shaking so bad I had to steady myself against the wall. The back door was unlocked, and I slipped out into their yard, looking around to make sure those BPS guys weren't still watching the house. I cut through their neighbor's yard and kept going, jumping fences and pushing through bushes until I was 3 blocks away where I'd parked my car. My shirt was torn from a fence, and my hands were scratched up from climbing over a wooden barrier, but I didn't care. I fumbled with my keys and dropped them twice before getting the door open, my whole body shaking with leftover fear. The engine started, and I drove away, checking my mirror every few seconds to see if anyone was following me. Nobody was there, but I kept checking anyway, taking random turns until I was sure I was alone. Back at my apartment, I locked the door and checked all the windows before pulling out my phone. I texted Leah saying I was in trouble and needed to talk right away, trying to keep it vague in case someone was monitoring my messages. She called within 2 minutes asking what happened, and I gave her the basic story without using Grace's name or specific details. I told her about the men in polo shirts, the threats, the ankle monitor, and the feeling that I'd stumbled into something way bigger than a girlfriend with family problems. Leah listened without interrupting, and when I finished, she asked if I was safe right now. I said I thought so, but I wasn't sure, and she told me to come stay at her place if I felt unsafe. Leah said I needed to call the police immediately and report what I saw, but I hesitated because I'd broken into Grace's house and recorded people without their permission. I was scared of getting arrested myself, or making everything worse for Grace's family if the cops showed up and BPS retaliated. Leah argued that what those men were doing sounded illegal, and the police needed to know, but I kept thinking about Grace's terrified face and her warning that interfering would get us killed. I told Leah I'd think about it, and she made me promise not to do anything stupid like going back to that house. I promised, and we hung up, but I couldn't stop replaying everything in my head. I barely slept that night, jumping at every sound from the hallway and replaying Clinton Black's voice threatening Grace's family. Every car that drove past my building made me get up and check the window to see if it was that black SUV. I kept my phone next to me and checked the locks 3 more times before trying to sleep. At 6 in the morning, I gave up and called the police non-emergency line, leaving an anonymous tip about possible unlawful detention at Grace's address. The operator asked for my name and callback number, and I stupidly gave my real number because I wasn't thinking clearly. She said an officer would follow up, and I hung up feeling like I'd just made a huge mistake. 3 hours later, my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. A woman identified herself as Detective Rhiannon Keller and said she was calling about the tip I left that morning. She asked pointed questions about how I knew about the situation at that address and what exactly I'd witnessed. I admitted I was dating someone connected to the family and had seen men threatening them in their own kitchen. Detective Keller asked if I'd been invited into the house or if I'd entered without permission, and I hesitated before admitting the door had been open. She made a note of that and said she'd look into it. Detective Keller explained that there were sealed complaints on file about that address, but private security companies operated in legal gray areas when families signed consent forms agreeing to monitoring. She said, BPS had lawyers who made sure everything they did was technically legal, even if it felt wrong. She warned me to stop investigating before I got hurt or ended up charged with stalking or breaking and entering. I asked if she was going to help Grace's family, and she said she'd do what she could within the limits of the law, but I shouldn't expect much. The conversation ended, and I felt more helpless than before. That evening, I drove past Grace's house and saw a black SUV parked in the driveway. I pulled over a block away and used my phone to photograph the license plates, zooming in to get the numbers clear. Back home, I searched online for plate lookup services and found one that gave basic registration info. The plates came back to a corporate registration under a company name I'd never heard of, but when I searched for that company, I couldn't find any website or details about what they did. It was like they existed just on paper. That night, I was checking social media and stumbled onto the neighborhood forum for Grace's area. Someone named Bert Olson had posted about a prowler cutting through yards earlier that day, and his description matched me exactly down to my jacket color. Several neighbors responded saying they'd watch for suspicious activity, and one person suggested calling the police if the prowler returned. I felt exposed and stupid for leaving such an obvious trail. If BPS monitored that forum, they'd know I'd been there running away from the house. The next day, Grace agreed to meet me at a public park, and when she arrived, she looked exhausted with dark circles under her eyes. I asked if she was okay, and she said she was fine, just tired. I brought up seeing her father tied to that chair, and she denied it completely, claiming I'd misunderstood what I saw in the dim lighting. She said her father had been sitting normally, and I'd panicked and imagined the worst. I told her I knew what I saw, and she got defensive, saying I was making everything worse by obsessing over things I didn't understand. I pulled out my phone and opened the audio file without saying anything. Grace's eyes went wide when she heard Clinton Black's voice coming through the speaker, then her father's rehearsed responses about protocol and compliance. Her face changed completely, like something inside her broke, and she grabbed the phone from my hands to stop the playback. She admitted the ankle monitor wasn't from any government program. It was from BPS. Her family had signed contracts when they were scared and desperate, and they didn't understand what they were agreeing to until it was too late. The contracts gave BPS control over their movements, their communications, everything. I asked to see the contracts, and she said her father kept them locked in a safe at the house. When she reached across the park bench to hand back my phone, her sleeve rode up, and I saw a dark purple bruise circling her wrist, like someone had grabbed her hard. I asked what happened, and she jerked her arm back, pulling the sleeve down fast. She told me I needed to stop asking questions, her voice flat and cold in a way I'd never heard before. The way she shut down completely told me everything about how BPS treated people who didn't follow their rules. She stood up and walked away without looking back, leaving me sitting there on the bench. The next evening, I parked 3 blocks from Grace's house and walked through the neighborhood trying to look casual. I found a spot behind a hedge across the street where I could see their driveway and front door. For 2 hours I watched and took notes on my phone about every car that came and went. A black SUV pulled up at 7:15, and a guy in a dark blue polo got out. The polo had BPS embroidered on the chest in small letters. He went inside for 20 minutes, then came back out and drove away. At 8:30, a different car arrived, and 2 people went in carrying clipboards. I wrote down the license plates, the times, physical descriptions of everyone I saw. The guy in the polo came back at 9:45 and stayed inside for 10 minutes. The pattern seemed like they were checking in on the family multiple times per day, making sure everyone followed the rules. Back home, I found the BPS website and stared at their contact page for a while before calling. A woman answered cheerfully, and I said I was interested in learning about job opportunities with the company. She asked what type of position I was looking for, and I made up something about security work. The receptionist started describing their services, using phrases like family relocation assistance and protective monitoring solutions, and comprehensive safety management. The corporate language made my skin crawl because it sounded so professional and normal, like they were describing insurance plans instead of keeping people prisoner in their own homes. She offered to send me information about their hiring process, and I gave her a fake email address before hanging up. I called Leah and asked if she knew anyone who could help me research a license plate. She said her friend Aziz worked in data research and might be able to help. I texted her the plate number from the black SUV, and she said she'd reach out to him. An hour later, Leah called back and said Aziz was willing to look into it, but he wanted to know why. I explained that someone might be in danger, and I needed to understand who was involved. She said she'd pass that along, and Aziz would call me directly if he found anything. Aziz called the next afternoon while I was at work. He said the plate was registered to a shell company that was owned by Black Protective Solutions. He'd found news articles about BPS providing security services for witnesses and people in hiding programs, but there were also mentions of lawsuits. Former clients had filed complaints alleging illegal detention and contract violations. Most of the cases had been settled out of court with non-disclosure agreements. He asked if I was sure I wanted to get involved with this company, and I said I didn't have a choice. He told me to be careful and said he'd send me links to the articles he found. I drove to the address I'd found for Bert Olson, the neighbor who'd posted about seeing a prowler. I figured I should apologize for cutting through his yard and try to smooth things over before he called the police. When I knocked on his door, he answered, looking suspicious at first, but his expression changed when I explained I was the person who'd run through his yard and I wanted to say sorry. He seemed surprised I'd come to apologize and invited me to sit on his porch. We talked for a few minutes about the neighborhood, and I carefully asked if he'd noticed anything unusual at Grace's house. Bert said he'd heard shouting and crying coming from that house at weird hours over the past year, sometimes late at night, sometimes early morning. He'd thought about calling the police, but figured it was a family matter and none of his business. My phone rang while I was driving home, and Detective Keller's number showed on the screen. I pulled over to answer, and she got right to the point. She told me firmly to stop interfering with her investigation. She'd heard I was asking questions around the neighborhood and watching the house. The sealed complaints she'd mentioned before suggested that other people had tried to help that family and gotten nowhere. I was just putting myself at risk for nothing. She said BPS had lawyers who made everything they did technically legal even when it felt wrong. I asked if she was actually investigating or just warning me off, and she said she was doing what she could within the limits of the law. Then she hung up. Grace sent me a text 2 days later, asking to meet at our usual coffee shop. When I walked in, she was already sitting at a corner table looking worse than I'd ever seen her. Dark circles under her eyes, hair pulled back messy, hands shaking around her coffee cup. I sat down and waited for her to talk. She finally admitted the whole truth. Her father had laundered money for a local real estate developer who was involved in some kind of fraud scheme. When the developer got investigated, her father agreed to cooperate with prosecutors. But before he could testify, BPS approached the family offering protection. They said the developer had connections to dangerous people who might retaliate. Her father signed the contracts thinking BPS would keep them safe. Instead, BPS used the contracts to control everything about their lives. The developer paid BPS to keep her father quiet and make sure he never testified. It wasn't protection. It was imprisonment disguised as security services. I told Grace I couldn't keep seeing her if she wouldn't be honest with me. She started crying right there in the coffee shop, tears running down her face while other customers pretended not to notice. She said she wanted to be honest, but BPS monitored everything. They tracked her phone, controlled who she could contact, and punished the whole family whenever anyone broke the rules. That's how she got the bruise on her wrist. She'd tried to call a friend from her old life, and one of the BPS guys grabbed her when he found out. Her father's ankle monitor would shock him if he left the house without permission. Her brother wasn't allowed to have a job or go to the school. They were trapped, and she didn't know how to get out. She reached across the table and grabbed my hand, squeezing it hard enough to hurt. Her palm felt sweaty and cold against mine. She pulled out her phone and typed something, then showed me the screen instead of speaking out loud. The message said she had something important to give me, but we couldn't talk about it here. I nodded, and she deleted the message immediately, glancing around the coffee shop like someone might be watching us through the windows. She stood up suddenly and walked toward the bathroom, and I sat there confused until I felt something under my coffee cup. I lifted the cup and found a small piece of paper folded tight. When I opened it under the table, I saw an address written in her handwriting along with a time, 11 p.m. tonight, and the words, "Come alone, no phone," underlined twice. The whole thing felt crazy, like something from a spy movie, but the fear in her eyes when she came back from the bathroom told me this wasn't a game. She sat down, and we pretended to have a normal conversation about work and the weather, while my mind raced with questions about what she wanted to give me and why we needed this much secrecy. After 20 minutes, she said she had to go and left without looking back, walking fast toward her car in the parking lot. The address led me to an empty parking garage on the edge of downtown, the kind of place that probably filled up during business hours, but sat completely dead at night. I'd left my phone at home like she asked, which made me feel exposed and stupid, but I trusted her enough to follow the instructions. My car echoed loud through the concrete levels as I drove up to the 3rd floor where a single car sat under a flickering light. Grace stood next to her sedan, looking around nervously, and when she saw me, she waved me over fast. I parked and got out, and before I could say anything, she shoved a heavy duffel bag into my arms. The weight surprised me, and I almost dropped it. She told me the bag contained documents that proved what BPS was really doing to her family, and she needed me to keep them safe, because if BPS found out she'd copied them, things would get much worse. I started to unzip the bag, but she grabbed my hand and stopped me, saying, "Not here. Wait until I got home." Her hands were shaking and she kept looking toward the garage entrance like someone might drive up any second. I asked her what was in the documents and she said proof of everything: bank transfers, forged contracts, fake identity paperwork, all of it. She said these papers were insurance because they showed Clinton Black doing illegal things, and if her family tried to leave, or if something bad happened to them, these documents could be used against BPS. I set the bag down and asked her to explain exactly what she'd copied. She said she'd gone through her father's files when he was sleeping, the ones BPS made him keep locked in his desk, and she'd photographed everything with her phone before printing copies at the library. BPS didn't know these documents existed outside their control, which made them valuable as protection. If they tried to move her family or hurt them, she could threaten to release the papers. I asked why she was giving them to me instead of keeping them herself, and she said BPS searched her room regularly and monitored everything she did. They'd find the documents within days if she kept them, but they didn't know about me, at least not as someone important, so I could hide them somewhere safe. The way she explained it made sense, but also terrified me because it meant I was now part of whatever dangerous situation she was trapped in. I grabbed her shoulders and asked her to come with me right now, just leave her family behind and run. We could get in my car and drive to another state, find her a lawyer, get real help from people who knew how to handle situations like this. She pulled away from me and shook her head hard, saying she couldn't abandon her family, even though part of her wanted to escape more than anything. They were trapped because of her father's mistakes, but they were still her family, and she couldn't just leave them to deal with BPS alone. I told her that staying was going to destroy her, that I could see it happening already in the dark circles under her eyes and the way she jumped at every sound. She started crying and said she knew it was destroying her, but what kind of person abandoned their family when things got hard? We stood there in the cold garage with the duffel bag between us, and I realized I was losing her no matter what I did. If she stayed with her family, BPS would eventually break her completely. If she left with me, the guilt would eat her alive. There was no good choice, just different kinds of pain. Back at my apartment, I locked the door 3 times before opening the duffel bag on my kitchen table. Inside, I found stacks of papers organized with binder clips, and I started going through them one by one. The first stack showed bank transfer records with account numbers and amounts, money moving between companies I'd never heard of, and accounts labeled with initials instead of names. Some transfers were for thousands of dollars, others for 50 or 60,000, all happening over the past 2 years. The next stack contained fake identity documents, birth certificates, and social security cards with Grace's family names, but different birth dates and places of origin. Someone had created an entire fake history for them, complete with school records and employment histories that never existed. I found contracts with signatures that looked wrong, like someone had traced them or forged them, agreeing to terms that gave BPS complete control over the family's movements and communications. The language was dense and legal, but I could understand enough to see that her father had basically signed away their freedom in exchange for protection that never came. At the bottom of the bag, I found a notarized statement from Grace's father describing specific threats made by BPS operatives, times they'd grabbed him or hurt him, when he tried to resist their rules and names of people who'd helped BPS keep the family isolated. Reading his words made my hands shake because it was all there in black and white, proof that this wasn't protection, it was imprisonment. One document near the bottom caught my attention because it mentioned a local real estate developer named in a federal investigation for fraud and bribery. I'd seen news stories about this guy, how he'd been building cheap apartments and bribing inspectors to overlook safety violations. The document showed Clinton Black listed as a consultant who'd helped relocate witnesses before they could testify against the developer. There were dates and locations, specific instances where people who were supposed to testify suddenly disappeared or refused to cooperate with prosecutors. My hands started shaking as I realized how deep this went, that BPS wasn't just controlling Grace's family, they were part of a bigger operation that helped criminals avoid justice by intimidating or hiding witnesses. Clinton Black was running a sophisticated witness tampering scheme disguised as a protection service, and Grace's father had gotten caught up in it when he agreed to testify against the developer. BPS had approached them offering safety, then used that access to make sure he never made it to court. The next morning, I made copies of everything at a print shop across town, paying cash and using the self-service machines so nobody would remember me. I put the originals in a folder and drove straight to the police station where Detective Keller worked. The officer at the front desk called her down, and she looked surprised to see me standing there with a thick folder in my hands. We went to a small interview room, and I spread the documents across the table, explaining how Grace had given them to me and what they showed about BPS operations. Keller picked up each document carefully, reading through bank records and contracts with a serious expression. After 20 minutes, she looked up at me and said that if these documents were stolen, I could be charged with receiving stolen property, and anything we found in them might not be usable in court because of how they were obtained. I told her I understood the risk, but people were being held against their will, and someone needed to do something. She said she appreciated that, but the law didn't care about good intentions, and I needed to be smart about this if I wanted to actually help Grace's family, instead of just getting myself arrested. Keller spent another 30 minutes going through the documents, taking notes, and asking me questions about where each one came from and what Grace had told me about them. She said some of this looked legitimate, especially the bank transfers and the notarized statement, but other parts would be hard to verify without cooperation from Grace's father himself. She asked if I thought he would be willing to testify about what BPS had done to his family, and I said I honestly didn't know, that he seemed too scared to do anything that might make things worse. She nodded like she'd expected that answer and said fear was exactly how operations like BPS maintained control. She strongly suggested I make a sworn statement about how I obtained these documents and what I knew about the situation with Grace's family. She explained it was the only way to protect myself legally while she investigated the contents, because right now I was just a guy in possession of potentially stolen documents with a story about a girlfriend and her family. If something happened to me, or if BPS came after me legally, a sworn statement would establish that I'd come forward trying to help, not trying to commit crimes. I left the police station feeling worse instead of better, like I'd just painted a target on my back by bringing those documents to Keller. I drove across town to a storage facility I'd looked up online and rented a locker using cash, giving a fake name that the bored teenager at the desk didn't bother to verify. The locker was small and smelled like dust, with a concrete floor and metal walls that echoed when I moved. I put the duplicate copies of all the documents in a locked metal box I'd bought at a hardware store, then hid the box behind some old cardboard boxes I found in the corner. It felt paranoid and excessive, but I couldn't shake the feeling that Clinton Black was dangerous enough to come after anyone who threatened his operation. Having backup copies hidden where nobody could find them seemed like basic survival at this point. That night I was watching TV at my apartment when my phone buzzed with a text from a number I didn't recognize. The message said, "Return what was taken. Continued interference will have consequences." No signature, no context, just that simple threat. I tried calling the number back, but it went straight to a generic voicemail that didn't identify who owned the phone. I tried texting back, asking who this was, but the message wouldn't deliver, showing an error like the number had been disconnected. My stomach dropped as I realized this was BPS, that they somehow knew I had the documents even though Grace said they didn't know she'd copied them. Either they'd figured it out or someone had told them, but either way they were watching me now, and they wanted their documents back. I sat there staring at my phone, reading the message over and over, trying to decide what to do next. I fell asleep on my couch around midnight, but woke up at 3 a.m. with this weird feeling that something was wrong. The apartment was dark and quiet, but my heart was already racing before I even knew why. I got up and walked toward my bedroom, and that's when I saw it. The front door was open just a crack, maybe 2 inches, and I knew I'd locked it before going to sleep, because I'd checked it twice after getting that threatening text. My stomach dropped, and I stood there frozen, trying to decide if someone was still inside or if they'd already left. I crept to my bedroom door and flipped on the light, and everything looked normal at first. Then I saw the photo on my pillow. It was a picture of me sleeping in my bed, taken from the angle of my bedroom doorway, and the timestamp in the corner said it was from tonight, maybe an hour ago. Someone had been standing right there watching me sleep and taking pictures. I ran to the bathroom and threw up, my whole body shaking so hard I could barely stand. They'd been inside my apartment while I was here. They could have done anything to me. I didn't even think about calling the police right then. I just grabbed my laptop, my phone charger, the documents from under my mattress, and some clothes, shoving everything into a backpack with shaking hands. I was out the door in less than 5 minutes, not even bothering to lock it behind me, because what was the point now? I got in my car and started driving, and once I was a few blocks away, I called Leah. She answered on the third ring, sounding groggy and confused, and I tried to explain what happened, but my voice kept breaking. She told me to come to her place right now and stay on the phone with her while I drove. The whole drive over, I kept checking my rearview mirror, expecting to see someone following me, but the streets were empty at that hour. Leah was waiting at her apartment door when I got there, and she pulled me inside and locked the deadbolt behind us. She was mad and scared at the same time, asking why I hadn't called the police immediately, and I said I just needed to get out of there first. We sat on her couch, and she made me tea while I showed her the photo on my phone, and her face went pale. She said this was way beyond threatening texts, that someone had committed a serious crime by breaking into my apartment, and I needed to report it right now before any more time passed. Leah made me promise I would file a police report first thing in the morning, and I agreed, because I knew she was right, even though part of me was scared of making things worse. I barely slept on her couch that night, jumping at every sound from the hallway outside. At 7 a.m., I called the police station and asked for Detective Keller specifically, and the person who answered said she'd pass along the message. Keller called me back within 20 minutes and said she'd come to Leah's apartment to take my statement. She showed up an hour later with another officer, and I walked them through everything that happened. Keller photographed the picture on my phone and asked detailed questions about when I'd last checked my locks and whether I'd noticed anyone following me recently. She admitted this escalation worried her a lot, that breaking into someone's home crossed a major line, and she wanted to send a forensics team to my apartment to check for prints or other evidence. The other officer took notes, while Keller explained that this kind of intimidation tactic was serious, and whoever did it was trying to send a message that they could get to me anywhere. She asked if I had somewhere safe to stay for a few days, and I said I was staying with Leah, and she said that was smart, to not go back to my apartment alone. After they left, Keller called me again and said she wanted to talk more about BPS and the patterns she'd seen in previous cases. She explained that companies like Black Protective Solutions operated in these weird legal gray areas where they used consent forms and contracts to basically hold people against their will. The families would sign agreements thinking they were getting protection, but the fine print gave BPS way more control than anyone realized. She said the system had loopholes that let companies like this operate without much oversight, because technically the families had consented to the monitoring and restrictions. Previous complaints against BPS had gone nowhere because the families were too scared to testify, and the contracts made everything look legal on paper. She said my case was different because I was an outside witness who could describe what I'd seen without being bound by those contracts, but she warned me that made me dangerous to them, and they'd probably try harder to silence me. I asked what I should do, and she said to keep documenting everything, stay somewhere safe, and let her handle the investigation. But I could tell from her voice she wasn't confident the investigation would lead anywhere fast enough to help Grace's family. Over the next few days, I started following the black SUV whenever I spotted it around town. I know it was obsessive and probably stupid, but I couldn't stop myself from gathering more evidence. I'd see it parked outside Grace's house or driving through her neighborhood, and I'd follow it from a distance, taking notes on where it went and who got in and out. The SUV would sometimes park outside a strip mall office building that had a small sign for Black Protective Solutions on the second floor. I photographed the building, the license plates of other vehicles in the lot, and the people who came and went. Most of them wore the same dark polo shirts with BPS logos, and they all had this professional security guard look about them. I felt like I was losing my mind doing surveillance like some amateur detective, but it gave me something to focus on, besides the fear of someone breaking into wherever I was staying next. Leah kept telling me I was taking too many risks, but I couldn't explain to her why I needed to do this, why I needed to understand exactly what BPS was and how they operated. One afternoon, I was sitting in my car in the parking lot outside the BPS office building, watching through my phone camera and trying to look casual. I saw Clinton Black walk out of the building and head toward his car, and without thinking, I got out and started walking in his direction with my phone ready to record. He noticed me immediately and changed course, walking straight toward me with this calm smile that made my skin crawl. He said something about how I seemed very interested in his company's operations, and I started to say I was just exercising my right to be in a public place. That's when he moved fast and knocked my phone right out of my hand. It clattered across the pavement, and I heard the screen crack. He leaned in close and said very quietly that I was making things difficult for everyone involved, and maybe I should consider whether my curiosity was worth the consequences. His voice was polite and friendly, but his eyes were cold, and I realized this was the most dangerous kind of person, someone who could threaten you while smiling. I bent down to pick up my phone, and he just walked away to his car like nothing had happened, leaving me standing there shaking. That evening, my phone rang from Grace's number, and when I answered, she was talking so fast I could barely understand her. She said her family was moved tonight, that BPS was relocating them to some other city, and once they disappeared, she'd never be able to contact me again. She was crying and begging me to do something with those documents right now, before it was too late, because this was their last chance. I asked where they were taking her, and she said she didn't know, that they wouldn't tell her family anything except to pack one bag each. I could hear voices in the background, and she whispered that she had to go, that someone was coming. I told her to hold on, that I had an idea, but she said there was no time, and hung up. I sat there staring at my phone, my mind racing through options. If her family disappeared, I'd never find them again, and all those documents would be worthless because there'd be no one to corroborate what they proved. I needed to act fast. I called Grace back and proposed releasing the documents publicly to media outlets, posting them online, sending them to journalists who covered corporate corruption. If the documents were public, it would be too risky for BPS to move or harm Grace's family because everyone would know about their operation. Grace answered, but she was crying, so hard she could barely speak. She said she was scared of what would happen if we went public, that BPS would retaliate and her family would pay the price. I told her it was the only way to protect them now, that once the information was out there, BPS couldn't make them disappear without drawing attention to themselves. She was quiet for a long time, and I could hear her breathing, trying to calm down enough to think. Finally, she said, okay, that she agreed, that it was their only chance left. She said we needed to meet somewhere public tomorrow to coordinate, somewhere with lots of witnesses and cameras so BPS couldn't try anything. We agreed on a busy coffee shop downtown for 2 p.m. the next day. The next afternoon, I got to the coffee shop 15 minutes early and picked a table in the center where I could see the whole room. Grace arrived right at 2 p.m. looking pale and exhausted, her eyes red like she'd been crying all night. She sat down across from me, and immediately I noticed men in dark polo shirts positioning themselves at tables around us. There were at least 3 of them that I could see, all pretending to read newspapers or work on laptops, but clearly watching us. Grace saw me looking at them and nodded slightly, confirming they were BPS operatives. I started to ask her about the plan for releasing the documents when I heard sirens outside. Through the window, I saw 2 police cars pull up, and officers got out and headed straight for the coffee shop entrance. Everyone in the shop turned to look as the officers came inside, and one of them pointed at me and said my name. He said they'd received a complaint about trespassing, and I needed to come with them to sort it out. I stood up confused, saying I hadn't trespassed anywhere, and Grace looked terrified. That's when I saw Detective Keller walk in behind the officers. She held up her hands and said there'd been a misunderstanding, that she'd handle this. The officers looked annoyed, but stepped back, and Keller pulled me aside and quietly explained that BPS had called in a complaint, claiming I'd been harassing their employees and trespassing on their property. She said she'd managed to intercept the call and respond herself to prevent me from getting arrested, but this was their move to separate me from Grace and intimidate us both. I looked back at our table and saw the BPS operatives had already left, melting away like they'd never been there. Grace was still sitting there alone, her hands shaking around her coffee cup. I walked Grace back to her car in the parking garage and watched her drive away, knowing BPS was probably tracking her every move. 2 days later, someone knocked on my apartment door at 7 a.m. and handed me a thick envelope of legal papers. The restraining order petition from Black Protective Solutions listed me as a stalker who had been trespassing on client property and harassing their employees. The paperwork looked official and professional, with detailed logs of times I'd driven past Grace's house and descriptions of me following their vehicles. They made me sound completely crazy, like some obsessed stalker who couldn't accept that a relationship was over. The petition requested I stay at least 500 feet away from all BPS employees and any properties they managed, which would basically prevent me from seeing Grace at all. I called the legal aid office in a panic, and they said I'd need to respond within 10 days, or the order would be granted automatically. That same afternoon, Leah called me sounding stressed and confused. Her HR department had contacted her asking questions about me and our relationship. BPS had apparently reached out to her employer claiming I was a security risk who had been stalking their staff and might pose a danger in the workplace. Leah said her boss seemed concerned and asked if she felt safe around me, which made her furious because she knew it was all manipulation. I felt horrible for dragging her into this mess and putting her job at risk just because she'd been kind enough to let me stay on her couch. She told me not to worry about it, but I could hear the strain in her voice. Detective Keller called me the next morning with an update that gave me the first bit of hope I'd felt in days. She said she was pursuing a narrow search warrant for the BPS shell company, based on the documents I'd provided showing illegal monitoring and coercion. The warrant would be limited in scope, but it was a start, and she needed me to testify formally about what I'd witnessed at Grace's house that night. I agreed immediately, and we scheduled a time for me to give a detailed statement at the police station. 3 days later, I got a text from an unknown number asking me to meet at a parking garage downtown at 9 p.m. The message said it was Grace using a new burner phone, and this would be the last time we could talk safely. I arrived 15 minutes early and parked on the third level where she'd specified. Grace pulled up in a different car than usual, probably borrowed from someone, and got out looking completely exhausted. Her eyes were red and puffy, like she'd been crying for hours, and she'd lost weight since I'd last seen her. We sat in my car with the doors locked, and she told me her real childhood name before BPS had created all the fake identities for her family. Hearing her actual name felt strange and sad, like meeting someone new who I'd thought I already knew. She explained that her family had been running from debt collectors and dangerous people her father owed money to, and BPS had offered protection in exchange for total control over their lives. Grace admitted something that hurt, even though I'd suspected it for a while. She said she'd initially gotten close to me specifically because she needed someone outside the family to move those documents out of her house where BPS couldn't find them. Her father had hidden the papers and told her to get them to someone who could use them as insurance if the family ever needed to escape. But Grace said her feelings became real over time, even though the relationship started as manipulation. The confession stung, but I appreciated the honesty, and I told her I understood why she'd done it, even if it hurt to hear. We spent the next hour creating a detailed safety plan together. I would make sealed copies of all the documents and leave them with 3 different attorneys, along with instructions to release everything if Grace's family disappeared or if something happened to either of us. Grace would keep a copy of the attorney contact information hidden somewhere BPS wouldn't think to look. I'd also file a sworn statement describing everything I'd witnessed and everything Grace had told me about BPS operations. The plan wasn't perfect, but it gave us both some protection and made it harder for BPS to make the family vanish without consequences. The next morning, I went straight to the legal aid office and filed the sworn statement Detective Keller had requested. The statement included detailed descriptions of finding Grace's father tied up, the ankle monitor, the documents proving illegal monitoring, and Clinton Black's threats. After that, I drove across town to meet with an attorney who specialized in whistleblower protection cases. He agreed to hold a sealed packet containing copies of all the documents, along with instructions about when and how to release them. The attorney explained this created a legal obligation to investigate if anything happened to me, or if I failed to check in within specified time periods. It felt paranoid, but also necessary, given how dangerous BPS had proven to be. The retaliation came fast and hit from multiple directions at once. 2 days after filing the sworn statement, I came out of Leah's apartment to find my car missing from the parking lot. I called the police and learned it had been towed for expired registration, even though I'd renewed it just 3 months earlier. The towing company said I'd need to pay $400 to get it back, plus show proof of current registration. That same afternoon, my landlord called saying he needed to discuss lease violations. When I met him at my apartment, he handed me a notice citing noise complaints, unauthorized guests, and damage to the property. None of it was true, but he had written complaints from neighbors I'd never even met. He gave me 30 days to vacate or face formal eviction proceedings. I packed what I could fit in 2 suitcases and headed back to Leah's couch, feeling defeated and displaced. She tried to stay positive and said I could stay as long as I needed, but I could see the worry in her eyes about what might happen next. Detective Keller called me a week later with news about the search warrant she'd executed on a BPS storage unit. Her team had found illegal monitoring equipment, including audio recording devices and GPS trackers that violated wiretapping laws. They'd also discovered files on dozens of families that BPS was monitoring under similar arrangements to Grace's situation. It wasn't enough evidence to shut down the whole company, but it was a start, and Clinton Black would face charges for the surveillance equipment. Keller said she was building a larger case, but it would take time, and I needed to stay patient. My phone buzzed with a text message late one night while I was lying awake on Leah's couch. The message came from Grace's burner number and included a photo attachment. I opened it and saw Grace's father standing in front of an unfamiliar house without the ankle monitor on his leg. He looked thinner but relieved, almost peaceful. The message just said, "We're okay for now," but didn't give any location details or hint about where they'd gone. I stared at the photo for a long time, knowing this was goodbye, and I'd probably never see Grace again or know how her story ended. I deleted Grace's burner number from my phone that same night and forced myself not to look up news about BPS or search for any trace of where her family might have gone. The next morning, I woke up on Leah's couch feeling empty, but also relieved. like I'd finally stopped carrying something heavy that wasn't mine to carry in the first place. Leah made coffee, and we sat at her kitchen table not saying much, and she squeezed my hand once before heading to work. I spent the day organizing the documents I still had and making lists of what needed to happen next, keeping my hands busy so my brain wouldn't spiral into what-ifs about Grace. The restraining order hearing came up faster than I expected, just 5 days after that final text from Grace. My attorney met me outside the courthouse and explained again that accepting mutual no contact was the smart play, even though it felt like admitting defeat. Inside the courtroom, Clinton Black sat with 2 lawyers in expensive suits, and he looked calm and professional, like this was just another Tuesday for him. The judge reviewed the petition and my attorney's response, asked a few questions about the allegations on both sides, and suggested we resolve this through mutual agreement rather than a contested hearing. I agreed to stay away from all BPS employees and properties, and they agreed to the same regarding me, and just like that, it was over in less than 20 minutes. Walking out of the courthouse, I felt sick knowing Clinton Black got away with everything he'd done, but my attorney reminded me that staying out of jail and alive was more important than winning. That afternoon, I called my company's employee assistance program and set up an appointment with a therapist for the following week. The intake coordinator asked basic questions about what I needed help with, and I said I'd been through a stressful situation and needed to process some things, keeping it vague. My first therapy session happened in a small office with comfortable chairs and a box of tissues on the table, and the therapist asked me to explain what brought me in. I told her the whole story from start to finish, and she listened without interrupting, taking notes occasionally. When I finished, she said something that hit me hard, that my need to save Grace had turned into obsession that put everyone in danger, including myself. I wanted to argue, but I knew she was right, that somewhere along the way, I'd stopped respecting Grace's choices and started thinking I knew better than she did about her own life. We scheduled weekly sessions, and she gave me homework about recognizing when I was trying to control situations versus actually helping people. Detective Keller called me 2 days later with an update that made me feel slightly less terrible about how everything turned out. She explained that Clinton Black was charged with illegal possession of surveillance equipment and violating wiretapping laws based on what they found in the BPS storage unit. The charges were minor compared to what he actually did, and the federal prosecutors had declined to take the larger case about illegal detention and coercion. She sounded frustrated when she said this, like she'd fought hard to get more done but hit a wall. I thanked her for trying and for believing me when I first came to her with my concerns. She said most people in my situation would have looked the other way, and she respected that I'd come forward even knowing it would cause problems for me. The conversation ended with her reminding me to stay vigilant and call immediately if BPS contacted me again. I started apartment hunting the next day because I couldn't stay on Leah's couch forever, and my old place didn't feel safe anymore. I found a 1-bedroom across town in a building with security cameras and a locked entry system, and I signed the lease even though the rent was higher than I could really afford. Leah helped me move my stuff from storage, and we spent a whole Saturday setting up my new place. She joked that I'd become paranoid when she saw me installing extra locks on the door and setting up a camera system I'd bought online. I laughed and admitted she was probably right, but she understood why I needed to feel secure in my own space. The apartment slowly started feeling like home as I established routines and made it my own. Weeks passed, and I fell into new patterns, varying my route to work and always checking my surroundings when I came and went. I brought the remaining copies of the documents to my attorney and asked him to hold them securely, and he put them in his office safe with instructions about what to do if I ever failed to check in. I stopped checking the news obsessively for updates about BPS or trying to find information about Grace's family. My therapist said this was progress, that I was learning to let go of things I couldn't control. One night, I decided to write out everything that had happened, typing it all into an anonymous post on a website where people share crazy stories. I changed names and some details, but kept the core of what happened intact, and hitting submit felt like releasing something I'd been holding on to too tightly. Reading it back as just another story on the internet made the whole experience feel less overwhelming somehow. Several people commented saying it sounded fake or like a movie plot, and I didn't bother responding because the point wasn't to convince anyone. A postcard showed up in my mailbox about 3 weeks after I moved into the new apartment. It had no return address and a postmark from a city I'd never been to, and when I flipped it over, I recognized Grace's handwriting immediately. The message was just 2 words in blue ink that said, "I'm sorry," and nothing else. No explanation or clue about where she was or how she was doing. I stood in my kitchen staring at those words for probably 10 minutes, feeling a mix of emotions I couldn't quite name. Part of me wanted to hire another investigator or try to trace where the postcard came from, but I knew that would be falling back into old patterns. I filed the postcard in a drawer with other important papers and made the choice not to respond or investigate further. In therapy, I talked about the postcard and what it brought up for me, and my therapist helped me work through the difference between helping someone and trying to control their situation. She pointed out that Grace had made her choice to stay with her family, and my job wasn't to rescue her from that choice, even if I disagreed with it. We practiced recognizing when I was slipping into that savior mindset with other people in my life, and I started noticing the pattern everywhere. It was uncomfortable realizing how often I tried to fix things that weren't mine to fix, but awareness was the first step toward changing. Detective Keller called one final time on a Thursday afternoon while I was at work. She told me the case was officially closed from her end, with Clinton Black accepting a plea deal for the surveillance equipment charges. He'd paid a fine and received probation, but no jail time, and BPS was still operating under a new name with slightly different business practices. She thanked me for coming forward and being willing to testify even though we never got to that point. I could hear in her voice that she wished the outcome had been different, that she'd wanted to take down the whole operation and help all the families BPS was controlling. I thanked her for everything she'd done and for taking me seriously when other people might have dismissed my concerns. After we hung up, I sat at my desk feeling a strange sense of closure, not the satisfying kind where justice is served, but the realistic kind where you accept that the system has limits and sometimes bad people get away with things. That weekend, Leah invited me over for dinner at her apartment, and I showed up with a bottle of wine and some flowers as a thank you for everything she'd done. She made pasta from scratch, and we sat at her small kitchen table eating and talking about the whole mess with Grace and BPS and how close I'd come to getting seriously hurt. Leah told me she was proud I'd survived it all and actually learned something from the experience instead of just moving on to the next crisis. She said she could see I was different now, more focused on my own healing instead of trying to chase after people who didn't want to be saved. I admitted that therapy was helping me recognize patterns I'd been repeating for years, always trying to fix broken situations and rescue people who hadn't asked for my help. We talked for hours that night, and it felt good to process everything with someone who'd been there through the worst of it. Leah made me promise to keep going to therapy and to actually work on myself instead of just dating someone new and falling into the same patterns. I promised I would, and I meant it this time. Life is quieter now in ways that feel both strange and good. I moved into a better apartment with actual security, and I vary my routines without being paranoid about it. I deleted all the Grace files from my computer and gave the remaining copies to my lawyer with instructions to destroy them if nothing happens in the next year. I stopped checking news sites for updates about BPS or searching for information about where Grace's family might have gone. My therapist helped me understand that some stories don't get endings, and that's okay, that I can't control other people's choices or outcomes. I started dating someone new about 2 months ago, a woman I met through friends who knows nothing about my past drama with Grace. We're taking things slow and building trust through honesty instead of secrets and mystery. She has a normal job and a normal family, and when I meet her parents next month, it'll be at a regular dinner with no fake names or hidden agendas. My new relationship feels healthy in ways I didn't know relationships could feel, with open communication and clear boundaries, and no one needing to be rescued from anything. Grace is out there somewhere, and I hope she's safe and free and living the life she wants. I've made peace with never knowing how her story ends, because it's not my story to finish. Life isn't perfect, and I still have bad days where I wonder what really happened to her family, but it's my life again, and I'm learning to be okay with the questions I can't answer. That's enough for now.